16 days since the Hamas terror attack, Israel has continued to step up its air offensive on multiple fronts. In Gaza, the Israeli military has claimed that in the last 24 hours, it struck 320 targets. As Benjamin Netanyahu convened a late-night meeting of his top generals and war cabinet to assess the escalating conflict, troops remain ready for an impending ground offensive into Gaza as well. In the north, there was a fresh exchange of fire over the border with Lebanon, amid fears that Iran-backed Hezbollah could also enter the conflict and start a much wider conflict in the region. Benjamin Netanyahu reacted to this possibility, warning Hezbollah that if they indeed enter the war, they would be making the mistake of their lives.
מה שאתם עושים פה ומה ששמעתי עכשיו מהמפקדים שלכם זה דבר חשוב מאין כמוהו. אתם הורגים אנשי חיזבאללה שמנסים לתקוף את קו החזית שלנו. אני לא יודע עכשיו, כשאני נמצא איתכם, אני לא יכול להגיד לכם כרגע אם חיזבאללה יחליט להיכנס בצורה מלאה למלחמה. אם חיזבאללה יחליט להיכנס למלחמה, הוא יתגעגע למלחמת לבנון השנייה. הוא יעשה את טעות חייו. ואנחנו נכה בו בעוצמה שהוא לא יכול אפילו לדמיין. והמשמעות לו ולמדינת לבנון היא הרסנית. אבל אנחנו ערוכים לכל תרחיש.
روز منطقه همانند بشکه باروت است. هر گونه محاسبه غلط در ادامه این جنگ افروزی، نسل کشی، قتل عام و کوچاندن اجباری ساکنان غزه و کرانه میتواند پیامدهای سنگین، تلخ و گسترده ای رو هم در منطقه هم علیه منافع جنگ افروزان در منطقه به همراه داشته باشد. مایلم هشدار بدهم به ایالات متحده آمریکا و عامل نیابتیش رژیم جعلی اسرائیل که اگر فوراً جنایت علیه بشریت و نسل کشی در غزه را متوقف نکنند، هر احتمالی در هر لحظه‌ای وجود دارد و منطقه از کنترل خارج خواهد شد.
But amid the escalation, the UN has warned against collective punishment of the people in Gaza, reminding the world that even war has rules. Remember, so far, 1,400 Israelis and 4,651 Palestinians, 1,500 among them children, have been killed in the conflict. And the UN has said things could get much worse. Gaza is set to run out of fuel in the next 3 days, leading to a humanitarian catastrophe. All right, so is there really a war crime taking place? Why are people of Palestine being subjected to collective punishment? Joining us to really demystify this entire argument is Natasha Hausdorff. She's a barrister. Thanks very much, Natasha, for speaking to us. Is Israel guilty of war crimes?
Well, thank you for having me. It's important to be clear that there is absolutely no truth whatsoever in these libels that are being propagated as part of Hamas' strategy against Israel and its entirely lawful and legitimate response in accordance with the rules of war and the international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. Plainly, Hamas' strategy here is, of course, to try and inflict as much pain as possible on Israelis, as we have seen with their barbaric brutality, but then to enlist the world to give them to support and to parrot their propaganda, including the allegations that you have raised, in order to seek to restrain Israel's entirely lawful response. And it's vitally important that we recognize that the key principles of international humanitarian law, proportionality, necessity, and distinction, are always upheld by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. They were in previous operations, and even though the size of this operation is unprecedented, the ethical code of the IDF and the involvement of its lawyers, military lawyers, in approving the strikes and in approving operational decisions remains unchanged.
Now also, according to the convention, murder, torture, hostage-taking, humiliating and degrading treatment are banned. Also, war crimes like attacks on civilians, civilian settlements, humanitarian workers, destroying property where militarily is not necessary is also not allowed. Now, aren't these rules being violated, for example, in two cases? One, where a church was attacked. Second, where in the West Bank, a mosque was attacked. 4 people died in the second episode. And in the first attack, at least 36 people are feared killed.
So the IDF has always been very clear that it does not target civilian or protected buildings. And objective assessments of the Army's activity in previous operations have confirmed this. When these schools, hospitals, and churches or mosques are being used by Hamas as sites from which to operate their terror infrastructure. So either as rocket launch sites or as storage for weapons or as command and control centers. And we know, and the international media even has reported, that the Shifa hospital in Gaza City serves as the Hamas command and control center. Under international law, when terrorists are hiding behind civilians and abusing the rules of war and committing real war crimes by using civilian and protected buildings for terrorist purposes, they lose their protection in international law. Nevertheless, Israel does not target these buildings where its proportionality analysis indicates that there will be excessive harm to civilians as a result of these strikes. So on every level of this equation, Israel is complying with the rules of armed conflict, while Hamas is exploiting them and also seeking to exploit public opinion and the coverage of this conflict. And that is something that every responsible individual around the world has a duty to stand up against. And media broadcasters in particular have a very important duty not to spread Hamas propaganda. The casualty figures that are being quoted coming out of Gaza, I must stress, come out of the Hamas-controlled health department, Ministry of Health in Gaza. They make no distinction between civilians and combatants. And as previous conflicts have shown time and time again, the numbers coming out of Hamas-controlled organizations cannot be trusted. What we have on the other side is an army that is made up of citizenry, that is accountable to a democratic state where NGOs hold the army and decisions that are made by the military to account in courts. On the one hand, we have the IDF and the information that they put out. And on the other hand, we have this absurd moral equivalence that is being drawn by with a genocidal terrorist organization. And the international media and people all over the world have a responsibility to stand up for the truth of this.
Even if we don't believe the death figures put out by the Palestinian Health Authority, 29 staff members of the UN Refugee Agency have also been killed. They have officially said that their staff members were also attacked. Is this not a contravention?
We simply don't know the facts attaching to the deaths that have been reported. What we do know is that Hamas continually use human rights organizations within the Strip. They have infiltrated so-called human rights NGOs and humanitarian organizations. We also know that Palestinian rockets that are fired from the Gaza Strip onto Israeli civilians frequently fall short in the Gaza Strip. In the last exchange, which was with another Palestinian terrorist organization, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, in 2021, a third of their rockets fell short in the Gaza Strip. And these rockets kill civilians and aid workers without a doubt. They fall indiscriminately. These are not targeted strikes with precision that Israel carries out to avoid civilian casualties to the best of its efforts. These are indiscriminate. That needs to be called out.
If we just set aside the military response for a second, aid agencies have asked for aid material which is being rushed in by various countries to be given to people in Gaza. Now, one relief is that it's currently being allowed, but one doesn't know whether this will be going on for a long time or this is a one-off. To put Gaza under a complete siege, isn't this directly impacting civilians and civilians alone?
The impact on civilians from a siege under international law has to be the subject of proportionality assessment. So there is absolutely no obligation on Israel under international law to continue to supply its enemy, a terrorist organization that is seeking its annihilation. That is the starting point. Thereafter, there is only an obligation on Israel to facilitate aid, humanitarian aid, from third parties where it is not going to be diverted to the enemy forces, to the Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups. What we are seeing, which is shocking, is that the first aid convoy to have been allowed in was not subject to checks by UN staff, even though this was made explicitly one of the conditions by President Biden when he announced that aid would be going in through the Rafah crossing into the south of Gaza. What we have seen time and time again is that these unscrupulous terrorist organizations steal provisions from aid organizations and seek to smuggle in weapons and reinforcements for their battle against Israeli civilians through tunnels and through aid convoys. And again, the international community has a responsibility under international law and in particular UN Security Council Resolution 1373 to make sure that terror organizations are not assisted directly or indirectly. And the international community is currently failing in its obligations under international law to ensure also that under the Convention Against Genocide, the genocidal terrorists, Hamas, are prevented from carrying out their aims ever again.
All right, to set the record straight on the law and whether Israel is guilty of violating it or not, thanks very much, Natasha Hausdorff, for joining us here on Times Now. Quick break.
Thank you for having me.